Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and we're going to talk about my humble stick here. Well, we're not really talking about the stick, we're actually talking about the way that weapons handle, and usually on this channel I'm talking about swords. And swords are obviously hugely popular in popular culture and martial arts and everything else, but also there's weapons like axes and warhammers and things like that that equally would apply to this. Now, what inspired this video was I have a large lineup of swords here which I'm working on reviews on at the moment, including things from Windlass and LK Chen and elsewhere. And when I come to describe how a sword moves, and obviously when you're watching on the other side of the screen, you can only get an inkling of it from your end. And when I'm describing how it moves, it's sometimes difficult to convey that through words and even on the screen, but I think that sometimes when you can see an object moving around, you can get some sense of how it moves. Now, what's funny is that a lot of people who want to start training, particularly if you want to start solo training, will go out and buy a sword, for example, but you don't need to. A stick is, for most purposes, it doesn't matter whether you're starting to practice the fundamentals of small sword or rapier, or whether it's saber or long sword or katana, it doesn't really matter. A stick, a bokken, a single stick is a very useful training tool. But moreover, it's also quite a useful basic analogue to start to describe a kind of baseline, a ground zero, to describe how different swords handle. Okay, so if I just pull out a sword that I've done a review of in the past, it's a Royal Arsenal sword, so it's the Han Dynasty Chinese dao, okay, short dao in this case, intended to be used with a shield mostly, but they were used by themselves and they were used with bucklers as well, I think. So if we actually handle this, this is quite interesting because this is quite a minimalistic sword, okay? It's not particularly long. It's sort of the size of a machete, but it's narrower and thicker than a machete. So it's a similar amount of steel and mass to a typical garden machete, but it's in a slightly different form. It's a stiffer blade, so better for thrusting. It's a narrower blade, so it might not be so good at cutting vegetation, despite the fact that's what I do in my tests quite a lot of the time. It might not be so good at cutting vegetation as a machete, because a machete is a specialised tool for that job, but it is a better weapon, and it's a more robust weapon than a machete would be, and it's better for thrusting than a machete would be. But it's quite a minimal design in terms of its hilt, and I spoke about this in the video on this particular sword. One of the reasons for that is probably to do with economy. These were literally kept in arsenals, so in storage depots for state weaponry to equip soldiers, militia and other, of the armies with. So these were mass produced to some extent, obviously to a certain standard. They didn't want them to break in use and require constant maintenance, but they were nevertheless fairly minimalistic and fairly basic. So you have got a very simple handguard, you've got a ring pommel, which is essentially welded onto the tang, and then you've got no real guard to speak of, you've got a bolster really there. And funnily enough, because this is quite a minimalistic design, if I closed my eyes, despite the fact that I can feel a difference in the cross-section of the grip, it's rectangular more or less, it does actually handle quite similarly to a stick, because we don't really have any pommel to speak of, we don't really have any guard to speak of. What you've got really is a bar of steel, and in this particular case the tang as well is almost the full width of the grip, which makes it very strong, but it also means that you're not taking away any mass really, or no notable amount of mass in the grip. It's just a continuous bar, and a continuous bar, surprise, surprise, is pretty much like a continuous mass of any material, and the way that that dowel moves around is quite similar to a stick. And there's nothing wrong with the way that a stick moves around. You can move it quite deftly, but there's one interesting detail with the humble stick and how you can simulate different swords with it. So if you add mass at different points, or if you hold it at different points, it handles like a very, very different object. So if we look at this stick and hold it at the end, okay, now it handles very, very differently to how it was handling before, because all of the mass is now in front of my hand, there is nothing behind the hand. Now, mass behind the hand can be achieved in several different ways. With something like a long sword, or the langmesser behind me here with a long grip, or something like a Burmese da, or indeed a katana or wakizashi. These types of swords have a long, elongated section of handle, if you want to call it that, but tang with the associated hilt, so wood over the tang usually, and some kind of pommel at the end. And it doesn't particularly matter if the pommel has mass, although we'll talk about the pommel in a second, but the fact is that you've got this length behind you. So if I hold the sword like this and move it around, it moves very much more like a katana or a wakizashi or a dao, a da rather than a dao, or a langmesser, or anything which has an elongated grip. But also it handles quite like things which have a weighty pommel. So if I switch over to the windlass Munich sword here for a second, something which has a large pommel at the back there has a similar feeling to it to having the extended grip out the back, because it's mass, and mass is mass at the end of the day. It doesn't matter whether mass, grab a different sword, it doesn't really matter whether the mass comes in terms of a long hilt behind the lead hand, or whether it's a large weighty pommel, particularly if we look at swords like the Deltin, whatever model of sword that is, I can't remember now, St. Maurice maybe, with the Brazil nut pommel there. So it's mass behind the hand. And as I say, you can simulate this with the stick by having some mass behind your hand. Now, there is a difference between feeling of a sword and the physical the physicality of the shape of the sword and how that might interfere with how you use it. Now, very clearly, the shape of the grip, the style of the grip affects how you hold the weapon and how you can use it in different ways and how you interact with it. But equally, the hilt, so the guard specifically, it can interfere with how you use a sword. And clearly, if you have quillons or guards sticking out sideways, if you have a knuckle bow, if you have finger rings, if you have side rings, that changes a bunch of characteristics about the sword. It brings mass back in front of and around the hand, which changes the inertia in different ways. Incidentally, if you have a long guard, I use this sword for now, but a medieval sword like the Zweihander behind me would be a better example in some way. In fact, I'll tell you what, I'll use the Zweihander because it's a bit clearer to demonstrate. If you have a guard where there is mass sticking out sideways, that means that not only do you have the normal sort of motion inertia in this way of moving like a stick, like a big heavy stick, but also you've got rotational inertia this way. Now that can both be an encumbrance and a help. How is it an encumbrance? Well, quite simply it means that when you want to reorientate the sword, when you want to turn it, you have to apply more energy to do so because you're using rotational inertia to do it. If we take something like this Chinese two-handed sword here, that doesn't have that rotational inertia issue because it has barely any guard to speak of, so it can revolve around itself very, very quickly. And obviously, this guard is primarily here for protection, to protect your hands and arms, so it has a huge benefit to it and it's worth having that there. But you have to always remember it comes at a cost. And hopefully regular viewers of this channel will know that. It comes at the cost of added mass, weight, but also it comes even at a cost of rotational inertia and how much energy it takes to move the sword around its axis. But what I was going to say was that it also comes with a benefit as well, and a lot of people don't think about that benefit because they don't notice it, because most people tend to only train with one specific genre of swords. So people who do Japanese martial arts or Chinese martial arts or European martial arts tend, not always, but tend to only use the swords of that type. But what's interesting is that when you have a cross guard like this, it does actually, because you can feel the edge alignment and you can feel which direction the guard is pointing in physically, but also in terms of that rotational inertia, it does actually help with edge alignment as well. Right, we're going to leave that point and come back to the humble stick. Let's just hang the Zweihander back up on the wall. Right, so coming back to the humble stick, the stick lacks that guard element. So in some ways you could say that the stick is better in terms of modelling the kind of characteristics, the movement characteristics of swords such as, I'll pick a different example, such as this Chinese jian, which doesn't have much guard, doesn't have a weighty pommel, and in this case has a straight blade as well. This is really only looking at straight swords. Curved swords are a different kettle of fish, although if they're slightly curved it doesn't make too much difference. And actually this in the hand, with some variables, which I'll come into in a second, does actually handle really quite similarly to the humble stick. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's not a criticism, because a stick actually handles really quite well. Now, going back to the point I made before about holding it at the end, if I go from holding it here, which is naturally, I think, where most people would hold a stick if they were actually fighting with it. But if we go to holding it at the far end, which is shown in some stick fighting systems, it's obviously done with single stick in Europe, because single stick usually simulates, certainly within the Anglo world, simulates the use of the basket hilted broadsword and later the sabre or cutlass. And so holding at the end is kind of necessary because you're not supposed to have anything projecting at the end. But it does mean that in relative terms, although it's a fairly light stick, it does mean that in relative terms your point of balance is much further up the blade than it would be in an actual sword, which has weight to the hilt and brings the point of balance back. But nevertheless, you can still simulate the sort of movements that you do with a sabre or with a broadsword with a stick, and it doesn't feel hugely different, especially when the point of balance being further up is compensated by the lightness of the stick. But what I was going to say was that when you have a weighty pommel at the end, if you can add a weight to the stick to simulate that, of course, and that will give you a similar feeling. You could perhaps wrap the bottom of the stick in lead sheet or something like that, and that would give you a similar feeling as well. But fundamentally, this is the baseline. By moving your hand to different points, or indeed by using a stick which isn't parallel like this, but is tapered, and I'll come on, that relates to the point I made about the jian, which I'll come back to in a second. You can simulate the feeling and motion, the kind of path and rotational inertia and movements through the air that you get from different types of sword. Now, what's interesting is if we look at a real sword, so I pick up that jian, I'll pick up a different jian this time actually. So one of the things which characterizes swords is they tend to, not always, there are obvious exceptions like falchions and messers and stuff, but they tend to taper in mass, so the mass distribution tends to taper down and reduce as you go towards the point. So many swords have distal taper, that means they get thinner in this way, they start off thick here and get thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner, and they have profile taper this way, so their silhouette, in other words, they are a pointy shape when you look at them sideways, they get narrower and narrower towards the point. Sometimes they can be broad blades that have distal taper, and sometimes they can be tapered blades that have no distal taper, and sometimes you have both. In fact, lots of swords, and it has to be said, a lot of the swords that people find, oh, these feels really nice in the hand, it's really, really simple. It's just because the sword has really good distal taper and profile taper. If you give a sword tapering down to here, quite simply it means the mass distribution is nearer the hand. It's easier for you to move the sword, and I've heard people describe swords as handling like a lightsaber. All they're really articulating is that that sword has mass near the hand and is therefore easy for them to move around really, really quickly without much work. Now, conversely, that comes at a cost. Everything, as you'll see, like with most of my videos in this channel, every time you get a plus, you usually get a minus. The downside to that is usually the more mass you put nearer the hand, the less hitting energy you have with the tip of the blade. So quite simply, if you have a predominantly thrusting sword, yes, it's good to have lots of mass towards the hand, something like a rapier or a side sword, something like that, which is predominantly being used with the point. Certainly something like a small sword, lots of mass near the hand is absolutely fine. But if you're wanting to deal out fearsome blows with one of these things, then you want a certain amount of authority out towards the tip. And of course, the natural evolution of that are things like the falchion and the so-called Langmesser, big knife, long knife, where you actually deliberately keep mass out towards the tip to give you more hitting energy. So But coming back to the main point, all of these things can be simulated with the humble stick. So, to conclude, when I'm describing how things handle, and I think this is true of any reviewer, this is not just Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria, this, whether you're talking about any other channel where they review swords, I think for a lot of us, the baseline actually of how something handles is a neutral, parallel, non-tapered stick held at various points. And very often these swords, whether we say that they feel they've got a lot of presence in the tip, or we say that they've got a very nimble tip and feel, you know, close, they feel lively and closely balanced the hand, this kind of thing. A lot of the time, we're not just describing it within the context of the universe. Really, when it comes down to it, often the humble stick, is the baseline, the foundation level of what we compare everything else to. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I think in many, many ways, you know, the stick has been around for a lot longer than the sword. And in many ways, if we look at the earliest really good swords, the Bronze Age swords, the Ewart Park type leaf blades and the earlier Bronze Age rapiers, in a sense, they are a variation on a bronze sharpened stick in terms of their physical handling. And if you look at the Bronze Age so-called rapiers, which are more of a sort of dagger really, thrusting weapon, they are more balanced towards the hand. And if you look at the leaf blades, they are deliberately balanced out towards the tip, like the Langmesser and the falchion, to give more striking force, as well as still being able to thrust. But the baseline, if you're measuring all these things on a graph, the baseline in the middle is this stick or any other stick. I hope this has been sort of thought-provoking. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts and experiences on this. As you can see, I only showed you about half or even less than that of the swords I've got here to review. So there are lots of sword reviews coming up. And I'll see you again soon on Schola Gladiatoria channel. Give us a like and a subscribe and take care, folks. Cheers.